Hello everyone, welcome to the Eternal Card Breakdown. My name is Pojo. Glad to be with you today. I've been feeling a little burnt out on Eternal, but a lot of the reasons for that are changing. There is a huge balance patch coming out tomorrow, Tuesday the 14th, which should be releasing and should generally be changing a lot of different things, including yet another nerf to Grodov Stranger, the absolute ruler of Expedition and a strong throne staple at this point. So we are going to be discussing all of the nerfs to different cards and buffs to certain other cards, talking about changes to merchants, changes to strangers, changes to Stone Scar aggro, and a bunch of Recano Expedition changes as well. There's a lot of interesting stuff to be talking about, so let's go ahead and get right into it and talk about, first off, the biggest and baddest cards, Grodov Stranger and Makkar Stranger, both receiving yet another nerf today. So Grodov Stranger was a 6/6 for 6 that when you play a Stranger, you get a random sigil. When you attack, shuffle Void and draw 2 cards. Now, when it attacks, it is only going to draw 1 card on its attack, meaning that Grodov Stranger, while still having the instant value of playing power out of your deck, no longer turns into an inevitable card engine on the turn that it's played when you Predator's Instinct it, which I think was sort of the biggest problem with Stranger in general, is that you could very consistently get it out, Predator's Instinct it, play it, attack with it, and then even if it wasn't dealt with on a turn when you didn't have Predator's Instinct, it would still run away with the game because the amount of cards that it drew just made it very, very hard for you to not see more Grodov Strangers, more Strangers in general, more value, to the point where it was just overwhelming and pretty impossible to stop. This is still a pretty strong card. Even this nerf does not necessarily make Grodov Stranger unplayable. It is still a card that draws a card every turn that it is attacking, and a card that shuffles Voids, which is a really, really useful ability that is much, much more beneficial than silencing Voids. And when it's a Void of your choice, it's still a really, really powerful option that saves a lot of things in Expeditions. That being said, this really does potentially put a damper on how many decks are going to be running Grodov Stranger as the only thing that you are doing, and basically trying to make it their goal to run Strangers just because Grodov Stranger is such a powerful top end. It was basically at the point where you could not build a time deck without putting Grodov Stranger in it. The mid-range on this card was just absolutely absurd. The control was ridiculous, and it's a pretty big deal. I think that overall this should be a welcome change to the card that actually really kind of changes up how much value it is generating, and also makes it a less likely choice for Throne, which is a place where I think it was really not somewhere that it should be getting so much traction over, say, cards like Heart of the Vault and other stuff that we've already seen in time that have been getting that kind of setup. I think this is a very, very good change. I'm very glad to see Grodov Stranger getting nerfed again. I think that, as far as Strangers go, the design of Strangers has been very fun for about the first month or so, but similar to Sliver formats, it gets old pretty fast, and the weaker that these cards are, I think the better off it is at the moment. I'm in for the balance change. I think that Grodov Stranger's balance change should be very, very good. Looking forward to dusting my copies, although we will, of course, be making fancy premium versions with the money, since it's a cool card and it looks great. So yeah, we're gonna be playing with this card still. I think it might still make it into Throne decks. In Expedition, it's still going to be a staple time card for sure. But in both situations, the power level of it has been massively decreased in terms of its overall just overwhelming value. That being said, it's still a great toolkit card. It still has good impact on board. It still does something the turn that it's played, and can do something the turn that it attacks. And in both of those situations, this is still a card that you want in your arsenal. The nerf to it really shouldn't be a reason for you to disenchant this card. It's still very, very good. The other card that's gotten nerfed is Makkar Stranger, and the nerf to that one is significantly more serious, I think. Makkar Stranger is going from a 4/3 to a 4/2, so the durability on this card is going down even lower. In Expedition, where this card is particularly popular, that's going to be a very big deal because Blazing Salvo costs 1. So a 5-drop that dies to a market 1-drop that then gets you into another removal spell, that's a real problem, even if the card is stealing the top card of the other player's deck on the turn that it is played. Makkar's Stranger provides immediate value in a very good way on the turn that it is played, and then also its attack trigger is very, very good at prohibiting basically any strategy that doesn't involve strangers. When you're attacking with Makkar's Stranger, you are always getting a card's worth of advantage on the board, which is, I think, it is a mite stronger than just drawing a card, to be sure, and it is just generally very, very powerful to have that type of effect. But in addition, since the card always replaces itself with a somewhat random enemy card and gives you information about your opponent's deck, steals cards, that kind of thing, this is a card that definitely can see a durability buff or durability nerf and not see as much play as a result, and still see play even if you aren't playing with it. I think that even if you are not like making it the core of your strategy. I think that Expedition will still run Makkar's Stranger. I think this is less likely to be a throne card now that it is very, very hard to get durability off of it. It is, however, a pretty wanted nerf, and it also means that like Makkar's Stranger is going to trade on the turn that it attacks in most situations. It's just not going to be able to get through and completely punish with just turn after turn of constant advantage. Both of these nerfs are aimed at sort of, I think, removing the consistency of the late game of Makkar and Grodov Stranger, and I think in both situations they do some pretty good stuff. Like, that attack trigger is rough, and if you are not dealing with it, then bad stuff happens to you. So this is something that makes Killer Makkar's Stranger something that is going to be a much more even trade, even though you are getting, of course, the card of advantage off of it. And it also just makes Makkar's Stranger like a lot more likely to trade with other things and a lot more likely to die to other things. In those situations, that's very, very good. Again, I don't think this is a card that you necessarily disenchant, but if you want to get the extra dust and play around with different ideas, that's certainly an option that is available, because both of those will be available for the full cost for a week or two after they are nerfed. So yeah, those are the major Expedition changes. There are a lot of other changes that we're going to be talking about as well, but like those are the two that like for Expedition and Throne should make the biggest impact. That being said, there's still a lot of stuff out there that is kind of prohibitive and very, very powerful at the moment. The next thing we're going to be talking about is nerfs to Stonescar aggro. So let's go right to Crooked Alleyguide. Crooked Alleyguide was a 3/3, is going to a 3/2. This was a 1-cost card that turned into a 3/3 with Unblockable on turn 3, which, that was always ridiculous since it also gives you the Scout ability on top of that. I would say that this is still a pretty powerful aggro card. Decreasing the durability does not decrease the ability of this card to fix your early game, while also giving you a good source of damage on 3 that is fairly durable later in the game. A 3/2 just means that it is more likely to trade later in the game, and that's also the turns that you're playing Bandit Queen, so this is a minor nerf, but it's nonetheless a pretty important one. Crooked Alleyguide being a 3/3 for 1 has always been just completely absurd. This also means that the card is just not that good on rate when you're playing it at 3, which is very important for reducing the overall power of that setup. Yeah, this stat line was ridiculous, and it definitely was paying off very well for Throne Stonescar decks. Nimble Conscript. Nimble Conscript is going from a 3/4 to a 3/3. Similar situation here. This card combined with the other option in Stonescar aggro was allowing shift decks to just rule the landscape. You could easily pair it with Bandit Queen. It's very, very durable, so it's hard to remove. And then the amount of durability on this card just made it an incredibly good aggressive option. This is a really powerful shift card. I don't mind it going down to a 3/3. It does lose a little bit of its identity as a result of that, but it's still a really durable red drop that you don't usually see at 1. I don't see any reason why this wouldn't see play anymore, but I do think that the nerf is somewhat warranted for Stonescar. It's not necessarily the place that I would have hit, but I think it's a fine place to hit in terms of durability and increasing the amount of interaction that you can have with Stonescar aggro. This also allows you to Hailstorm it, which is a pretty big deal because Hailstorming the shift deck is actually something that does come up a lot and is a solid way to deal with aggro in general. So Hailstorm might be coming back on the menu now that cards like Nimble Conscript are no longer on the menu for Stonescar aggro. They'll still have Champion of Chaos for 4/4, but they'll have to be much more careful about when they play Champion of Chaos, since that card too can be Hailstormed. Finally, Inspired Prank is going up from 3 to 4. This is a really funny one for me because, like, I have never liked this card. It is nonetheless a very powerful Yeti aggro card, and, like, in terms of Throne, it's just been very, very good for a while since it is effectively free, and you can do a lot of things with it if you can put it into your market and then play it as a free card in Yetis. A big Yeti with an extra snowman for all of the spells in your void was a big deal. The increase in cost to this won't necessarily hurt Skycrag Yetis in a big way, but it does mean that they aren't playing that 76th card at quite as good of a rate, and may not even be playing it in the market at all, although even for not a terrible price depending on how many spells you've got in the setup, since it's effectively just one card out of your market, and your market is not the place that you're looking to kill people from when you're playing in Yetis. So yeah, it's a pretty decent change. I think it definitely gets you a little bit of a bonus to the Skycragro, or a bit of a nerf to Skycragro, and I think that overall that should reduce some of the Throne potential as well. All right, next set of changes are aimed at Expedition Recano. There's quite a lot of these, and they're all aimed at some pretty powerful cards that have been around for a little while. Emblem of Shavka, going from a 3/3 down to a 3/2. That increases the vulnerability of the card pretty substantially. It means that it trades more often. It means that it's basically not quite as free of a 2-drop, and the overall damage of it is going to be reduced somewhat because it's, once again, losing durability. Red is a risky setup in general. Like, red has always had... Fire has always had a very risky sort of attack-based strategy where you are expending a lot of resources to get a lot of damage. Emblem of Shavka did not have as much risk as other cards, and I don't mind the health getting taken off of this card, since this was by far the most powerful emblem. Linray, Makkar. Makkar definitely saw some play for a while, and Emblem of Grodov was insane in the time that Elysian was around, but like Linray and Shavka have kind of been ruling the landscape for a while due to their very high attack stats and their relative durability, and of the two, Emblem of Shavka was the card that traded the most, while basically having the least disadvantages of the Decimate. So yeah, that's a very strong emblem that's getting nerfed, and I think that that's a reasonable change to it. Shen-Ra Unbreakable's Mastery is going up to 10. This really limits the amount of damage that this card can do, since it means that you have a lot more turns to interact with it, find a way to deal with that invulnerable to damage, and the fact that it is, of course, immune to weapons and curses. Well, curses anyways. But yeah, the Mastery is now going up to 10, so you have an extra turn to deal with it before it becomes a 5/4, which reduces the clock at which it can kill you. Overall, that seems like a solid change to Recano aggro, since this card was always pretty ridiculous, but yeah, this is just like, the nice thing about this is that it opens up a few more interaction windows with Shen-Ra without necessarily sort of making the dream of Shen-Ra unrealizable. I think that it is a pretty serious nerf in terms of what Shen-Ra does, since a lot of Shen-Ra's power comes in that sort of pattern, and that 5/4 buff is definitely something that you're really looking forward to getting, and not getting it a turn later is, yeah, I think that's a pretty big deal. This legendary might not be as playable in Expedition in the future, but overall, it's still an invulnerable to damage 2/1 for 1. It's still a very powerful card for 1. I don't think it's necessarily going to be completely out of play, but I think that this is something that does make a pretty big difference in comparison to some of the other nerfs that we've seen. Tinker Overseer, now a 2/1 instead of a 2/2. This card was always an extremely good rate card. It was a very good rate card in the Empty Throne. This is a set 1 card that was a 2/2 flyer for 2, and a 2/2 flyer for 2 is definitely not that bad of a stat line. The +1/+1 ability, which tends to trigger pretty frequently when you're playing with relic weapons, really made this card shine. It's always been kind of a pretty solid option. This card is now going to trade a lot more often and have a lot more risk when it comes to burn spells. It's much more vulnerable to stuff like Blazing Salvo and Condemn. I think that the change to this is very likely to remove it from a lot of different decks. It's not going to see nearly as much play as a result of this, but it is still a reasonably aggressive flyer. But yeah, like in Throne, this card dies to Vara's Favor, it dies to Condemn, it dies to Blazing Salvo after you play a relic, it dies to a wide variety of things that can kill it at 2 or 3. And it's just very, very hard to get this card to enough of a buff that it's not killable by some form of red damage. So yeah, it's a flying unit that's a lot more vulnerable as a result of that health nerf. I think that that's going to be a pretty significant change to it overall. Acclaimed Artisan, mastery has gone from 4 to 6, so the exalted trigger is not going to happen nearly as often. I think this one, I'm not sure about this one overall. I would have almost preferred that this card got maybe like a nerf to its health or something along those lines, just because the exalted option is something that helps out stuff like Rujin, and it just sort of realizes certain dreams in Oni where you're trying to get a bunch of like weapons together. Acclaimed Artisan's exalted trigger is now sort of an afterthought on the card. It's mostly just a good block of stats with a good block of stats for other Oni. So of the 3 things that it can do, one of them it can't do very well anymore. But it can still get exalted under certain circumstances. When that happens, it's a pretty good benefit, but also this is a card that you've always been able to sort of play around, and making that exalted slower makes it much easier to play around the card if you are so inclined. Overall, this was clearly part of a pretty aggressive Rakano deck, and that Rakano deck was clearly doing very, very well. So as far as things go, I'm fine with this one. It doesn't really wow me one way or the other, and I think that Acclaimed Artisan can still see play just due to its excellent Oni buffs and general behavior. So Kodash's Stranger. Kodash's Stranger is going from a 2-2 to a 2-1. Yes, please. This is a really important nerf because not only does it make the card much more vulnerable on its first attack, which is a very big deal, since if Kodash's Stranger attacks once and gets away with it, it's typically going to attack twice and get away with it, and then spiral completely out of control in a very, very fast way. But the other thing that this does is it reduces the durability of the unit that you're playing after you are playing Kodash's Stranger, which is a very big deal in terms of being able to interact with boards that are playing Kodash's Stranger and just generally dealing with the massive amount of value that these decks produce. All of the Strangers right now are really kind of so high on value that it's tough to play jankier decks because just good stuff is so good. I think that this is a really important change to open up other expedition options, and in the same way that Makkar and Grodov's Stranger have been nerfed, Kodash's Stranger's nerf is very welcome. This was definitely the runner-up for most powerful Stranger after the 2 powerhouses. I don't mind it getting a tap after both Grodov's and Makkar's have gotten lost. Master's Blade is getting nerfed. This one's a pretty significant one, especially since it is a fairly big nerf to unseen setups and anything battle skill based. But this is going from a 3-cost 1-1 to a 3-cost 0-0 with the same +1/+1 for each of the wielder's battle skills. It's still a 4-cost way to play Fall Short while also giving a buff to unseen, but the overall dream of it, realizing the invoke in particular, is a little bit harder to reach, and being a little bit harder to reach is often the difference between a turn 1 play of Master's Blade into 2 cards worth of advantage and a turn 1 play of Master's Blade into just a single hit or the removal, and then the removal that your opponent needs coming through at slow speed. So this card's not going to invoke nearly as often. It's also not going to deal as much damage, which I think is a little less important, and it doesn't provide as much survivability, which I think is very important. In all of those situations, I think it's going to see a lot less play, but it's still going to be fine and Unseen are going to want to play it. It's just going to reduce the rate of those Unseen decks quite a bit. Speaking of Unseen decks, Bisma Revered Elder is losing its Entomb. Now it just gets a random battle skill every time you play another Unseen. As far as I'm concerned, this makes the card mostly unplayable. It's still pretty capable of getting completely out of control, but the Entomb ability was the massive value engine that Bisma really needed. I think this card was way too strong previously. Now it's a 3/3 for 3 that gets battle skills after you play other Unseen, which is kind of okay, but like overall I think that the general change to it is enough to nerf it into relative obscurity. You can run Unseen decks without Bisma now, and I think that's what you should do in most situations. However, I do agree with the justifications for this. The Entomb ability kind of clashed with the way that Exalted behaved in this card. So when you were using Exalted, you would get a unit that gave battle skills from Bisma's Entomb, and then you would also get the Exalted weapon that would give the battle skills to something else. It was pretty complicated and confusing, and it was just like such an obnoxious card. I actually just despised Unseen aggro as a result of this card being such an easy high roll. I think that it's a really, really important change and overall should improve the meta for the better in a pretty big way. Unseen aggro roll may still well be a thing. It's just not going to high roll in quite as many different ways, and it's not going to as consistently roll out RNG against you, which I think is really, really important because high rate RNG decks are just not that fun to play against, and this is something that in particular was a very, very egregious example of how RNG can get out of control. It was pretty interesting to see this card become popular, since it was, when it was released, just not very good, but it got that buff to 3 recently. I think it was a 4-cost 3/3 previously. I could be wrong about that. It may be that just nobody played it up until a point where Unseen became very, very popular. In any case, this card has been the scourge of the ladder for a while now, and its presence in Expedition, it will not be missed. I don't imagine that we'll see too much of it, but when we do, it'll still be kind of interesting and kind of fun to play around with. I just don't think it's going to be nearly as high on rate. All right, that's all the nerfs. Now we get to talk about the buffs. There's some interesting ones here and some dangerous ones. Notably, Defiance is coming back up. But first things first, we got to talk about the merchants. As we know, all of the merchants were recently nerfed, but they are coming back up into strength. Ixtun Merchant is getting rebuffed to a 3/3. I can't remember if this was always a 3/3. Yeah, it was a 3/3 when it was originally released. I'm pretty sure. So getting back to a very safe space where it is just capable of dealing a lot of damage, being survivable, and generally being pretty powerful while also getting cards from the market. Seems like a reasonable change, since this is a card that was nerfed by becoming a smuggler. Changing the identity of this card a little bit to be the powerhouse red card definitely makes that help out a lot better. So, I think that overall this seems like a reasonable change. Ixtun Merchant is a very dangerous merchant now, however, so I'd keep an eye on this card in the future, since this is a stat line that tends to be pretty dangerous in red, as we've recently seen. Jennev Merchant is going from a 2/2 to a 2/3, changing it up from Rhine Conclave Smuggler, but not buffing it back to its original glory, as it used to be a 3/2 at one point. This changes the identity of the card to a much more defensive option in blue, but as a blue-black market option, it seems like it's going to be pretty strong and also fairly obnoxious. This is one that I'm actually a little bit worried about. It's very survivable, and it fetches really, really good cards from the market, and it's just very hard to kill. I think that value in blue is going to be a little bit more attainable, and this might be the source of a lot of problems in control decks that really, really want to play units that are just not easy to kill and then get more value out of the market as a result of it. I think overall this card is very, very strong, and the consistency of its Aegis combined with the consistency of its health base means that you're going to be getting value out of it very, very frequently in a deck that's going to be particularly obnoxious. Kerendon Merchant going to a 2/2 deadly. I think that's a manageable stat line. Certainly Kerendon Merchant's weakness was always that it was capable of getting killed by Condemn or other options. This gives it some good trade against the big time decks and the big fire decks. Anything where you're playing mid-range stuff is just going to have a harder time getting rid of Kerendon Merchant incidentally, which is something that Kerendon Merchant has always suffered, but also is something that I think could be potentially pretty irritating. As a Praxis player, I'm not fond of it. As a general, in terms of general game design, I think it's probably fine. Overall, 2/2s with Deadly have been generally removable by a lot of different tools, and Praxis in particular hasn't had as many problems with it as I would expect. So I don't expect this card to be too much stronger on account of the fact that people aren't playing Two-Face to a huge extent. It's still a thing where you get a lot of value out of it, and it is a survivable Deadly unit, but I think overall that's a manageable stat line. Winchest Merchant getting an additional health. It is a 2/3 flyer now. I don't think that's a particularly meaningful change. It doesn't increase the clock of the flyer very much, and the survivability of a flyer is a little bit less important in the terms of this particular card, especially since this card is usually paired with a lot of very survivable Valkyries that are often doing a lot of the damage themselves. But the extra survivability definitely does help. It just doesn't trade with that many things in the air that I can think of, so it's mostly a matter of whether or not this is capable of dying to Blazing Salvo or Char or other stuff like that, and I think that buff is definitely wanted, but probably doesn't increase the strength of this card in comparison to Jennev Merchant, Ixtun Merchant, and Kerendon Merchant. It's still a good merchant, and it's always been a good merchant, so it definitely didn't really need a lot of buffs. I think you always want this card as a flying merchant in general, so it seems reasonable that this card would get a buff. Auralian Merchant gets no changes at all. That's not a surprise. This card was bonkers at 1-4. It was bonkers at 0-4. It's still good now at 0-3, and that's the reason that they haven't changed it. From the text on this one, they say that it is still the most widely played merchant by a good margin and quite successful. I believe them on that. That rate seems right. Auralian Merchant is a card that I always want to see as at 0-4 or 1-4 because I really like Praxis, but I understand that it is, in fact, a horrendously good card, and as far as things go, it's fine that this one didn't receive a buff. Alright, Transpose is also getting a buff. I'm not a fan of the one-cost market spells in general, so buffing these in general doesn't really appeal to me, but Transpose was not a card that was getting played in comparison to the other fast spell market choices, so it makes perfect sense to try to change that up and give a couple of new choices to help out with the general lack of ability that it had. Transpose is a card that protects your relics. It's very, very good in tradition mid-range, and the way that they're changing this is they're adding 1 extra damage to it, so it now deals 2 damage to the enemy player. I think in that situation, the main thing that's going to be happening as a result of that is that it's going to kill stuff like Sword of Icaria and other relic weapons. There are a bunch of relic weapons that it can now deal with, and that can be a bit of a help. The extra damage in terms of overall clock isn't going to be quite as meaningful, but 1 cost for 2 to the face is not the worst. I think that you would rather have the extra damage than not. Overall, this seems like a relatively minor buff. I would much rather that the other market cards see nerfs. Still, seems fine. This is going to be a pretty interesting card in Tradition Midrange, and I'm really hoping that Tradition Midrange sees a pretty significant amount more play as a result of the buffs that we have yet to discuss, actually. There's one more change to Tradition Midrange, 3 actually, that we are going to be pretty excited about. Also, in the Transpose era, we have seen Yeti Pult get a really significant buff. Yeti Pult, as a 4-drop, can now be, instead of paying 7, you pay 5 to exhaust it and draw 3 cards. That's a pretty good rate for the card draw on it. It also means that you can play this at 9 to draw 3 cards and deal 1 damage to 3 enemies, which, while a relatively minor effect, I think gives that card a lot of flexibility. Overall, I think that's something that should be pretty interesting, and Yeti Pult should be a bit more of a playable card as a result of that. It's such a fun card. I really like the design of this one. I've always enjoyed playing with it, so I'm hoping that that goes out pretty well. Yeah, okay. Next up, here's the big one. Defiance, coming back from 1 cost, kill an attacking unit 2 or less to 1 cost, kill an attacking unit with 3 or less, and stun an attacking enemy unit with cost 4 or greater. So it's returning to its original state. The justification for this I'll read out loud. With fire aggro setting a new high watermark for recent times, particularly those with powerful and aggressive 3-drops, we determined it was the right time to restore Defiance to its previous glory, offering an effective potential tool for slowing aggressive decks down, helping open up space for strategies that go a bit bigger. Yeah, looks like we're going to be seeing a bigger meta in Throne. I'm not sure how I feel about this change overall. Defiance was very oppressive at the time that it was originally out. At this point, Throne has a lot higher card quality, so aggro decks can maybe get around it a little bit more frequently, but this is definitely a change that is going to make that a little bit harder, and you could still play Defiance in some situations in the current setup. As far as it goes, it's clearly a very powerful card. I definitely think we will see it. I don't know if that's going to be good for the game or not, and I guess time will tell whether or not this will lead to a resurgence of very obnoxious control decks, or whether or not it will just be a general drop in the bucket against aggro. I think it's definitely somewhere in between the two, but I also think it might be trending a little bit too much towards control depending on what's going on. All right. Last bit of changes. We have a couple of changes to big legendaries, and we have some changes to help out Tradition midrange. So Shardbinder, once a 3-1, going to a 3-2. This may be my favorite change in the entire set, apart from, of course, Grodov and Makkar Stranger getting nerfed. I think that I really like this card. I really like playing with its relic spellcraft abilities, and like there are a lot of fun relics with spellcraft abilities. In particular, all of the armor sets, Kodash's armor, Shavka's loot, Grodov's burden, Linray's codex, all really fun with Shardbinder, but the primary problem with Shardbinder is that every time you played it, it would immediately die to a Condemn or a Blazing Salvo. Now it just dies to Blazing Salvo, and also it's not going to die to as many different incidental sources of damage or have as hard of a time trading. I think the survivability on this card means you're much more likely to see the Dream here and play the Spellcraft reduction. That could lead to some pretty interesting and disgusting things happening, and I'm pretty excited to see all of them. Most of our brews from, I think, Echoes of Eternity are these Grodov's Burden setups where we're just like doing weird stuff with relics. I look forward to going back to those decks and revisiting them because I think they're going to get a lot more powerful. So check out our brews. I believe the one that we've got is called... Oh man, I don't even remember what it's called. It's been a little while, but yeah, we definitely have a lot of good stuff coming up with that, and we'll be playing around with this card quite a bit. And yeah, in Tradition, should be a really, really solid choice. Ali, Champion of Kodosh, is going to silence a unit with enemy 5 strength or less, so it can now silence units that are a little bit bigger, including Makkar's Stranger, which I think is a pretty big deal. This seems like a pretty good change. Overall, this card is actually pretty strong in some situations, and there's a lot of different ways that you can play around with it. I like this card as a restrained action card, but that is like a tradition-based deck and something that we would really like to get some benefits to. So should be really interesting. Overall, I think that Ali, Champion of Kodosh, could do some pretty cool things as a result of this, and I'm excited to see what those things are, because this seems like something that could be very interesting in terms of overall power level, since it still requires that relic to be a good stat line, and the silence ability is just nice for dealing with a wide variety of scary things. Most notably, this gives the card a lot of interaction with dragons, which is a very big deal. Like, silencing dragons is kind of the number one thing that you want to be doing with Ali, Champion of Kodosh. That's the number one thing that Ali of Champion of Kodosh couldn't have done previously. So yeah, that's going to be a big deal. Display of Tradition. Now when it silences the enemy void, you also draw a card. That seems like a really reasonable change. I still don't think you take that option very often, but it at least allows you to cycle the card when you don't need it, so that seems like a reasonable option if you don't have anything better to do on turn 3. Kill their void, or rather silence their void, draw a new card, and then get into your 4 and 5 drops or get the power that you desperately need. This makes it much more likely that you will want to run Display of Tradition, even though neither of Display of Tradition's other modes are particularly interesting. I think that both of them do have some benefits and often are okay in certain circumstances, but like, yeah, the silence draw a card thing definitely means that Display of Tradition can now be used consistently in these decks, and actually get some benefits with when you actually have relics down. And when you don't have relics down, you can cycle it out, find your relics. So not a bad change, definitely helps out Tradition quite a bit. I think that it could still maybe do with like a little bit of like a +1/+1 on the killer unit or something like that. If it were like a Xenon Initiation or something along those lines, might be more interesting. But yeah, like overall, this is probably still the weakest display, but could be a lot more useful and could actually make Tradition decks work now due to the fact that it's much more flexible in terms of what you can do with it. All right, finally, we have some legendary buffs. Geminen, the double Helix, going from a 6 to a 5. The purpose of these changes, of course, to make the dreams much more realizable for cards that have never realized their dreams. Geminen is just too expensive and far too deep on influence cost for it to really get that deal 100 damage ability, and since you have to use Mastery to get there, it's kind of a problem to try and get this to go off. I've actually never seen it go off for another player. I don't know if we've ever made it go off ourselves. We'll probably be building a deck around this now that it is a little bit cheaper, and it's a lot easier to start getting into more damage sources. It's also a lot harder for your opponent to remove it the turn that it comes out because, well, it's just going to come out a little bit earlier, and you're going to be able to play it into a lot more stuff. Overall, this doesn't really improve the strength of the card that much, except that it is a 5-cost 7/10, which is an absurd stat line. So pretty beneficial for Hard Skycrag. I don't know if you're ever going to get the mastery off of it, but that seems like an aggro option that you might actually really want to go for. So doesn't seem bad. Nahid the Immortal going from a 6 to a 7, which again makes that card like a little bit more easy to play. Although, of course, you always really want to be playing Nahid by getting 50 health if you can. In either case, this is a card that really benefits sacrifice decks. I'm not so sure I love this one, just because the 50 health or more option was definitely like really interesting, and I always liked playing around with that particular setup. I would rather have that cost reduced than have Nahid's regular cost reduced, since having the regular cost of Nahid be reduced means that it's much more likely to be played in sacrifice-heavy decks like the Shrine to Carvet decks. This seems like a buff to a deck that may, or a potential like change up to a deck that maybe doesn't really need a change up. It's already in a really strong place, but like, yeah, having a big 7/7 change could be something that might actually like help that deck out depending on that situation. I don't know. Overall, I think that Nahid is definitely a fun card, and I have no problems with playing it on 6. I'm just a little worried about where the meta takes us if Nahid becomes good. So we'll see exactly how that ends up working out. In any case, I'm really hoping for more Hall of Lost Kings type stuff and a little bit less of hard casting Nahid. So if I was going to change the card, I probably would have altered that alternate cost rather than the actual cost of the card. Still, it's a pretty fun card. I do like this card a lot, and I don't mind it seeing a buff because it's a lot of fun to play with. So, all right. So that was really, really cool. We have seen some interesting stuff in the latest couple, like, this is a huge amount of, like, nerfs and buffs. I think there's just been a ton of cool stuff happening. So, like, overall, I think that, like, this seems like something that can really change the meta for the better. Grodov Stranger and Makkar Stranger falling more and more off the map. Kodash's Stranger getting nerfed as well. Like, the series of nerfs that have come out are nerfs that I have, like, really, really wanted for about a month now, and I'm very excited to see where the meta goes as a result of this. I think that this opens up a lot of cards that aren't even being mentioned here, just due to the fact that now you don't have to deal with the fact that Grodov Stranger was just an insurmountable obstacle for most decks to overcome. At that point, I think that like there is a lot of potential to get into some really interesting new stuff. Maybe like focus your efforts a little bit more on dealing with stuff like dragons and sacrifice decks, while also being able to like deal more handily with cards that are just incidental value engines. It means that you have to spread your resources a lot less thin, and it means you can build a lot more jank, which means that we're going to be building a lot more jank. So I'm hoping to see you all tomorrow. We're going to be playing around with some new ideas, no doubt, and doing some fun streaming stuff online at 7 p.m. PST. You can find me on Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, and Patreon. Twitter is where I announce when we are going to not stream, but if we are streaming, it will be 7 p.m. PSTs, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. So thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed this breakdown, and I'll see you all next time with more Eternal Brews and many other fun things in the future. See you soon.